2, 3. This is John. I'm sitting next to Alex.
We're good? Okay. We're good.
Of selling services overseas. By some estimates, service industries account for close to 80% of the gross domestic product in the United States. Exports of services totaled some $58 billion in 2013 and represent a growing opportunity for the United States. However, exporting services presents particular challenges. The need to adapt and modify a service based on the local economy is almost a must. There are often barriers to trade that prevent service companies from breaking into new markets. We have with us 3 experts who have worked in multiple markets and will talk about the opportunities and challenges facing service companies. Actually, there's 4 experts that are with us, as you can see. So with quick introductions, we'll kick off this panel. Mike Violette is the CEO of Washington Labs. His company provides engineering services for clients in US, Europe, and Asia. He has operated several service companies in Asia for the past 10 years. Mike has considerable expertise in the areas of local partnering, marketing of services, and managing remote staff. Next to him is Steve Drake, who's the founder of Steve & Drake Associates and a marketing and public relations expert. Steve has direct experience in Beijing and has worked to set up overseas operations. Steve provides advice and consultancy on branding, product placement, and positioning. He provides service for domestic companies operating in various markets. Steve is the past president of the Maryland China Business Council. And next to him is Alexander Koff. Alex is the co-chair of the international practice at Whiteford Taylor Preston, a legal firm with global business practices. Alex travels extensively, meeting with clients in the markets of Asia, Europe, Africa, and South America. His practice focuses on international business transactions, litigation and arbitration, government investigations, and regulatory issues with an emphasis on international trade and the protection and enforcement of intellectual property rights. And then finally, John Malone. John is General Counsel and Vice President of Quality and Compliance for WTS International. As General Counsel for WTS since 2012, John has provided continuous support for corporate governance, business organization, and international expansion, including the creation of foreign subsidiaries and structuring international transactions. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you.
We're going to kick off this panel with a question around developing new clients in overseas markets. And I'll direct this question to both Mike and John. So how do you develop the new clients in these markets? And then what resources have you found to be effective and useful in international client development?
Well, if I could go first, John, thank you, Kelly, and pleased to be here this afternoon at this really seminal event. I think the thing that you have to realize when you're looking to expand overseas is that you have to have a little bit sense of adventure. You may not know that you have clients there until you get there. So one time I was in Saigon and I stepped out and I had a day to kill. And there's always vendors out there willing to take you on little tours and so forth. And I walked out and across the street was a guy waving his hand. "I've been waiting for you my whole life." I said, "Okay, I'm going with you." So he had a day job and I got a great rich cultural experience. So I think part of that is tapping into what the local needs are, but also tapping into local culture and understanding a little bit about what they are asking for or what they're needing. Some of the earlier topics that were discussed were about figuring out local culture and having an appreciation for it. And you really have to, I think you have to love where you're doing business or you shouldn't be there. And we do quite a bit in China, and there was the gentleman who made Mr. Leventhal made the remarks about Chinese language being important. So I've tried, and I know my associate Steve has tried to learn Chinese, and he's much more fluent because he's spent more time in Beijing cabs than me. And so I was trying my Chinese, which I first learned to find beer in the bathroom. And I'm chatting with a group of folks who are walking around, and two of the ladies were laughing. I say, "Why are they laughing?" And she says, "You speak Chinese with a Japanese accent." So immersion, I think, is probably number one before you can really figure out what the business angle is. So with that, John.
You know, I think our biggest start was, much like Barbara mentioned on the last panel, our clients initially is what drew us into the markets here domestically. So some of the largest companies we work for in the United States really emphasized to us, hey, we have business, we do a lot of work with hotel companies and other flagship carriers for hospitality industries. So they really nudged us in that direction. And then once we were there, the networking and the resources in the unique position we were in a service industry, we had instant connections with multinational companies. And then through building those relationships, I think, you know, it is all about building the relationship or finding that local support. From there, entering the market, we hired local employees that we had used and found ways to vet those through other types of services that are provided, USIAC and things like that with the Gold Star or Gold service. We found ways to really build those relationships and find local support, and they sort of helped us realize the potential of the market. We went in with just a small focus on these individual clients, and then by learning more and meeting more people and understanding the culture, met many larger developers and things that have really put us faster pace than we ever anticipated on the growth over there. So I think that is the biggest part of it, is developing the resources and also understanding the local markets. Without that, you're really just trying to operate from a distance, and it doesn't really produce the results, I think, that the company is looking for.
Awesome. So then, Steve, question your way. What mistakes do first-timers typically make as they're entering into these new markets?
Well, good question, and I'm going to answer it as Mike has already previewed through the prism of China. I set up operations, an office in Beijing and one in Shanghai for one of the large U.S.-based public relations firms about 18, 20 years ago, and in my seat over there, I had the opportunity to meet with a lot of CEOs of American companies, clients that would come over there, and not necessarily the first timers, but a lot of CEOs who you would think had been to China, whose operations were there. I think one of the mistakes was sort of mapping or extrapolating our culture in Beijing. So we'd be in a car and we'd go past, and there'd be a crowded McDonald's or a crowded KFC outlet, and the reaction by the CEO and others as well might be, oh, they want to be just like us. They're very Western. Never mind that they might just happen to like hamburgers or fried chicken. And so I think that's one mistake. The other very different sort of a situation is a lack of due diligence. Very few people that I encountered had Mr. Violette's sense of adventure, sort of like let's get out and research this market by way of walking around. And so there's sometimes, I think, for first-timers a tendency to prematurely trust local either consultants or agents, and particularly in China, where the word guanxi is so important. Guanxi in Chinese means connections, and everybody will claim to have the best guanxi, the best connections in China. And companies that are anxious to just get into the market will sometimes meet a very good-looking gentleman or lady who's checking them into the hotel, happens to speak perfect English, and sort of, oh, we need to hire this person as a consultant. So I would say those are sort of two mistakes that first-timers, I think, can often make.
Gotcha. And then Alex, question for you. What are the challenges of selling your services overseas on behalf of a smaller U.S.-based firm?
Smaller U.S.-based firm. We have about 160 lawyers in 11 offices. We're as far north as Delaware, down south through Virginia, and as far west as Michigan, because we do work for Ford. But we are smaller by the comparison of other U.S.-based law firms where you may have 1,000 lawyers on both sides of the Atlantic. So that's a good question. I think what you need to do, which also translates to how any of you in the audience would sell your own services, you have to know what you're selling, where you're good, and what will really tell to your audience. So I think that combines a little bit what John and Steve and Mike has said. Well, certainly with Mike, and I can say firsthand, I've been to Vietnam with Mike, and I should have gotten off the plane with him when that person waves their hands and says, take my cab. And I'm a lawyer, so I'm straight-laced, and I do what they say, and I stand in the taxi line. And when Mike says, oh, come on, let's go, you do have to have that sense of adventure, particularly when you travel with Mike, but when you're going abroad too. So I think, in answer to your question, how do I go ahead and do it? Can I tell a story about how I got my first client? I think I tried to identify, at least from my perspective, my law firm, who's going to be able to sell to me? Where are my customers going to be? And how am I going to break into this market? So I'd identified the areas where my clients are doing business overseas, and I also wanted to service them with solid counsel that's known by the bar, that can give respected advice and know that it's going to be correct, but also maximize my opportunity to get a return as well. So I targeted law firms that have the guanxi, that have the local connections that are well known and respected, but have no U.S. offices. So in some senses, I know the Hong Kong bar better than I know the Maryland bar. And so when I was out there, I'm out there maybe 4 times a year, I would say. And when people are talking about one person who's left one firm and gone to another firm, I know down to the firm, down to the person who's been there, because you invest the time and the energy to do that and make those issues important. So for you, know what your elevator speech is, know your 30-second talk, identify who the clients are going to be, and then try and get that throughput back. So sorry for such a long-winded answer.
No, that was great. That was great. And so we understand and can sort of relate to the fact that relationships are very important in any market, but particularly when you're working overseas. And I guess you guys have referred to this guanxi. And so the question is, expand on the importance of sort of local partnering and developing relationships, and then discuss the importance of ganbei and making these relationships. And I'll throw this out to Steve or Alex, or any of you can answer that question, actually.
Well, I think certainly when you are selling particularly a service, I think partnering at the local level is almost an essential. In our particular case, we went in as a joint venture. So, the firm I worked for here in the United States, we found, after much due diligence, we found a local Chinese partner. The way the joint venture worked, my company, my firm that I worked for was principally, the provider of the money, the cash, and our local partner, provided talent initially, as well as guanxi, as well as connections and certainly knowledge of the local market. So, for us selling, in our case, public relations, marketing, branding services, it was essential that we have a good local partner, not just in name, but as an agreed to joint venture in that particular case.
Also, one of the unique parts, our company, by delivering services, we do largely business-to-business type sales. We don't really target the end consumer. So in sort of a contrast, we've looked at the joint venture and that type of arrangement with some of the expansion efforts, but we found, and this sort of goes to the how do you expand part, finding the right local counsel or people that have a strong foundation in understanding the regulations there advised us, based on what you're doing with direct business-to-business type selling client services, joint ventures actually promote or have an IP risk, where somebody that you are, we could put up the money in the same way they put up the people, but in the business-to-business side of things, they could much just cut us out and step in and sort of capture all of the know-how that we've developed after being in business for 40 years, especially in the industry. Once they learned that, the joint venture route was actually not as much promoted for us. We were more focused on finding the right people that we could hire into our company directly. There's still a risk, I think, of losing IP or competition in that regard, but we were more focused on building our own presence there and then working with partners in the region that might be able to help us expand, but not really looking to share necessarily exactly what we're doing from a business perspective with our clients.
Mike, do you want to touch on that too?
Yeah, I'll just go sort of a prototype for what we did is we went to Asia in '99. You know how a phone call can change your life. So I was kind of bored at work, been doing that for 10 years, and the guy called up and said, "You want to go to China?" So I thought a nanosecond and went. And we met some folks through Taiwan, actually, as our bridge. And we found that connection, first we had the solid relationship. I would say we became friends after we developed the business together, but I recognized early that Taiwan is a great bridgehead because it's culturally Chinese and business-wise Western practices. So it's a great bridgehead for us. And then we finally mapped that into Hong Kong, but they're equity partners. They're full equity partners because the time zone difference is already so great. I don't want to be awake in the middle of the night worried about the bank account. So these guys have got skin in the game. They know what the drive is. Plus, they're of mature, age too in their second career. So it kind of worked out. So we took this prototype and mapped it into our expansion in Europe. Again, having a local guy with the local knowledge, but the local ownership too. So it's been a reasonable success, knock wood.
All right, so I'll take a crack at it if I can.
Yeah.
You asked two questions, local partnering and ganbei. So ganbei that's the Chinese word for what? Empty glass?
Dry cup.
Dry cup. So it's a drinking term. And I think it's not surprising that you do business with people you like, people you think, at base level you have to be excellent at what you do and you have to be able to provide the service, but people want to be around people who they like and they enjoy. And to that extent, you have different strata and different spheres of people wherever you are. I think in Asia, to an extent, the older group, if I'm a man and I'm dealing with another man across the table, there's a lot of drinking that's going on. In Europe, maybe there's a little bit less. With the younger generation, maybe that's not as important. But can I tell a story?
Sure.
So I was a young lawyer, and I didn't realize. I sort of stumbled into it. 3 weeks on the job. And I went out to dinner after we had done some work for this steel client, this Korean steel client. And we were at a Chinese restaurant, and they got Mao Tai, which is sort of, people in the audience know, it's a sort of like gasoline in a container.
But with that more intense flavor.
Yeah, more intense flavor. And so they passed it around. There's Lazy Susan, and these are the Korean steel clients, so they're real strong, hardy men, and they wanted to toast and drink, and that was part of the culture. So they would pour some, and my boss leans over and says, "It's starting." And I said, okay. So it came to him, and he took and they said, "Ganbei," what, empty glass, bottoms up.
Bottoms up, empty glass.
And so he negotiated. He said, "How about half?" And the guy's like, "Okay." So he drank the half, and then he came around to me and said, "Mr. Koff, ganbei." So I followed. 3 weeks on the job at a law school. So I said, "How about half?" And he goes, "You have catching up to do." So I drank the glass, and I didn't know what to do. So I pulled it away from my lips. And have you ever seen the movie Raiders of the Lost Ark? In that scene where she pulls it and she slams it down the table, and all the glasses sort of shatter a little bit. And so I did that, and they were really impressed. So then all of them started coming to me. One by one, they would all stand up and say, Mr. Koff, and then it just, why am I the one who's getting all this? But at the end, the guy said, he wanted to give me a very strong compliment. He wanted to say, you're like a real Korean strong man. You're like a real, he said, you are Superman. And I said, this is great. But it set the tone, because when we went to Korea to help the client and we were dealing with things, we joked and it was fun. And at that point, I wasn't certainly Korean, but I was accepted in as one of the other people. And that opened up a relationship, which was good. Particularly when, I don't know if you've ever been to Korea, but as a 26-year-old, I could no longer sit cross-legged, or as my kids say, crisscross applesauce. And so they have these tables and you have to sit down cross-legged. So I put my legs out to the side saddle. And of course they looked at me and they said, you look like Japanese woman. But you could joke and it was fine, but it made a big difference. So to the extent that you can create that personal touch, I think that's important.
Gotcha. Good stuff. I want to double back to one thing that John mentioned, and that was around intellectual property. And I was wondering, Alex, if you could address that whole topic, because we know the risk is real. And so how do you advise that individuals who are looking to expand their services into foreign countries, how do they minimize or mitigate their risk?
Good point. All right, so, and I'd like to hear also from the other panelists as well, and I've talked with John a little bit about this separately. I think there's a couple must-dos before you go. You have to identify where your markets are going to be. You have to understand what your dollar value is. So I don't know what your revenue streams are, but if you're a $10 million company in a manufacturing space and you're making a targeted 5% net profit, you have $500,000 to play with. Out of that $500,000, where are you going to invest that? Are you going to invest it in R&D? Are you going to invest it in a new employee? Are you going to invest it in legal measures? So you have to be careful with the dollars that you have. But if you're going to go abroad, and that's part of your comprehensive strategy, we've talked, and other panels have talked about export tech and how you can sort of learn to get a strategy. That's important. Specifically on the IP, I'm assuming that you don't have a patent necessarily, but if you want to apply for a patent, it's expensive on the front end, but at least you have a 2-year period before you start to roll it out to every other country, and you need to choose selectively where you're going to do that. Other forms of IP include trademarks and copyrights. Understand that in some of the foreign markets you have trademarks which are a first-to-file jurisdiction, particularly Korea, China, and some of the other places in Asia. So what that means is the first person at the courthouse with that name will register that right. I was dealing with a manufacturer of a personal skincare cream, which is now looking to expand into a market in Europe. And the advice which we gave them, and we talked with counsel, local counsel in that jurisdiction, was make sure that when you register for the certificate of conformity going into that jurisdiction and for that intellectual property right, that you own it, that it's not your distributor, because if the relationship severs, it's a real awkward position for you to have to license back your right or pay a right for somebody who then has that right in that own country. And the last point is be aware of the IP US rules that are in your arsenal. So you can always go to federal district court for a patent dispute, expensive, a lot of money damages. You could also do trade secret cases in local courts. But there's other things like the International Trade Commission, which is really powerful, which provides what we call an in rem remedy, which is against the item or the product that's being imported. So what that does is it gives you leverage to prevent the importation of these products, and the remedies and what you can do in a court versus this International Trade Commission where the Section 337 cases are litigated are a little bit different. And there's a case involving, it's called Tian Rui, involving the steel railway wheels for railroads. And this one company had two processes for making railway wheels. The second process they no longer use anymore, so they wanted to license it out, take that revenue, and then put it into some additional R&D. They had negotiations with Datong, which is another company in China. They executed a license, and then they also had negotiations with Tian Rui, and those negotiations fell through. So what Tian Rui did is they went and hired Datong employees, and they brought them in. So it was a trade secret violation with a misappropriation that occurred wholly in a foreign country. In a regular U.S. court, you wouldn't have standing to bring that action. But in this Section 337 proceeding, you can. And this was decided by the Federal Circuit, which said even though there have been misappropriation completely outside, because these are imported in and this is a trade statute, our measures will attach to it. So you need to also talk with good counsel to understand what you need to do on the front end, and then what are your remedies in case something bad happens.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, okay, awesome. Mike, did you have anything to add to that topic?
Well, as far as intellectual property protection, we deal with international standards, which are basically public access. So our customers, however, deal with that. And they have to come up with strategies. For example, one of the imbalances between China and the United States is the lack of free access for testing and certification for the Chinese market. So China can make all kinds of cell phones, access points, printers, PCs, you name it, test in China, sell globally. In order to get a Chinese mark, you have to send your product and all your technical data to a Chinese government lab. So tremendous amount of risk, and we talk to our customers about how you're going to mitigate that. So if you want the market, you gotta live with the risk, and there may be some abatement things on the IP side, but practically speaking, we advise them to identify, sector off that part of their process or design, delete component values, scratch off chip names. Don't give all the schematics that would perhaps lead to a complete design, complete rework of your product. But there are on the unfair trade practices, there are U.S. government resources being directed, because ultimately China is not living up to their WTO obligations. These are technical barriers to trade. And it's something that goes to the highest levels of the government and throughout trade associations that work. And it's discussed quite a lot in the United States. Until they do that and they fully implement rule of law, there are risks. So you need to identify those risks and isolate the best you can, or don't enter the market.
Gotcha. Another question. So Steve and John, if you could take a stab at this. What is the value of the American brand in international markets?
Well, in thinking about this, I think certainly the American brand can be, and again, I'll use the example of China, it can be very, very strong in China, but I think it's probably more effective when it's applied to, or when it's referring to a product as opposed to a service, which is what we're talking about. So, right now in China, the Apple iPhone, they can't keep those on shelves. Starbucks, coffee shops are, jammed with people, morning, noon, and night. Nike athletic wear is flying off the shelves, and part, not all, of those particular brands are they're successful because they're American. When it comes to selling services, I think from my perspective, it's a little bit different, given that there needs to be sort of thought leadership built up in whether it's law, accounting, public relations, et cetera, and there needs to a certain level of expertise needs to be built up. So that's not to say that an American law firm or an American public relations firm isn't going to be successful in a market like China, but leading with the country label is probably not as going to be as effective for a service as it might be for a particular product.
And even looking maybe on a more focused level, he was alluding to products and services. It also, we found it's industry. The law firms, the crowded markets are going to have a more difficult time of having that American-made standard, because there is a lot of competition. In our area of design and operations of spa and leisure facilities, there's no real company in China that does everything that we do. And in the industry itself, it's well known that our company does what we do. So they know it's almost, hey, if you want this done and you want it done right, you know where to go. And it's mainly, a lot of other countries don't really have the full scope of work or services that our industry or our company does in our industry. And because we're well known, there is a craving for that American service there. But I think it's more industry related than the fact that we're from the United States. It's more specific to the fact that we are strong in our industry and have that reputation. So it's a desirable thing, whether it's in Asia or South America, anywhere. They know 40 years of spa expertise isn't something that you can just study or learn. The people is what they're really going after, and whether they're local Chinese people that we have trained in our company or how to do our processes or access to our IP, that's what's more valuable in that standing rather than the specific made in America on the service end. So I would agree. The services, it's much more competitive unless you're in a niche industry where you can really bank on the reputation you've built in that industry.
I would agree with John. In terms of sectors, American style public relations that was sort of a brand, and we all were in China at the time, during a time of tremendous growth. So we all had, frankly, more business, almost as much business as we could handle. But on an individual basis, it was very hard to distinguish, an American public relations firm from a European one, and at that time there was a mushrooming number of local Chinese firms as well.
If I could take that as a tangent, just particularly in our business, in the testing and certification world, like I mentioned, a lot of labs in China. We have a nice little sector of business where we went and visited several of these labs, checked them out, and my folks in Beijing go and buy test services for manufacturers and go and get it tested in a Chinese lab, then send it to me to ink Washington labs on the front, because the Chinese don't trust the Chinese labs. And I don't want to beat up on China, because I love China. I love China. But this particular thing is an American brand that sticks out. And I think it goes back to some of the other panels they talked about, reputation and the trust factor, which is huge.
Alex, you wanted to add?
Well,
something?
I was just going to say, I had a conversation with Fred Hochberg, who's the head of the Exim Bank, and with Bill Burwell, who's the head of the local USIAC, and Carl Livesay, who just stepped down as active chair of the DEC. And not only is it important to say that you're an American brand, because that does really help advance your product, I think. Overseas, Paul Quinn, who was here from Ellicott Dredge, I think they would all attest to the fact that carries weight a little bit farther. However, I would also urge you to take advantage of all the programs that the agencies I just mentioned have. So even if you're a small exporter, you can take advantage of the programs that Exim Bank offers to you. So the export credit insurance. Peter Bowie, who works with Paul Quinn at Ellicott Dredge, I think he said that his receivables, he has a better return on getting them back from his foreign sales than he does from his domestic sales, because he takes out, or he has in the past taken out, export credit insurance from Exim Bank. So by being an American company, by being here, you can take advantage of the gold key services that John talked about before. So not only do you have the reputation and the quality and the ingenuity and the innovation, but you also have programs to help gear this, especially as the president was moving forward with doubling exports in the first 5 years of his presidency.
And one other thing I want to point out from a regulatory standpoint, our country has pretty robust regulations when it comes to foreign corrupt practices, and being, I think, a leader in the WTO, and part of our obligations, obviously no country is perfect. He alluded to China might not meet their obligations. Everyone has their own incentives, but the framework, I think, of a lot of regulation is derived from things that the U.S. is a part of. So I think there is an inherent trust. There are some people that might not follow the rules and get into trouble, but there's an inherent trust that our economy is something that is built on a foundation of compliance or regulation that really does give a stamp of, okay, a minimum, battle tested, that we've gotten through this far in the compliance sector. If we're entering these markets, there's some level of, I guess, regulatory compliance that we've all met in order to take that next step.
And it's taken years to develop. It didn't happen overnight, and the developing countries just haven't had that time to develop these things. So it's quite understandable they don't have the infrastructure.
But you can also use that. I mean, as John mentioned, did you mention the FCPA by name, or did you say
No,
compliance in
I'm
general?
just saying just foreign corrupt practices in general.
So for foreign corrupt practices, that's in lawyer speak, it's offering anything of value to a foreign government official to obtain or retain business or for any other improper purpose. I'm going to test you later.
I got to stop doing that.
But basically, it means no bribing, right? But France used to be able to. They used to permit their corporations to deduct the bribes from their taxes. And so as an American company, people looked at that as a hindrance. The United States was out there. They pushed through the OECD. Now the UK enacted several years ago a arguably more stringent law that's even more far-reaching than the United States' law. But it's also a double-edged sword. It can be a positive benefit for you to say, our company won't allow it. And not only that, we are prohibited by our government's laws from offering these bribes. And that can be also an extra advantage.
Especially when you're providing services to government agencies. I think in some respects the temptation is there when in other cultures that it's largely accepted, but I mean, we have clients here domestically that we work with in providing joint services. The Foreign Corrupt Practices Act compliance paperwork that we have to fill out alone, we're on such notice of it here in the United States that even a hint of it is like, well, is that, you bought him coffee, is that okay? We take those steps, but call it just being, too watchful, but I think that there is that element that is sort of in our culture.
Yeah. I also learned early in a case that if there's an investigation, even if you're found to be innocent later, and that after 6 months is produced on page 22 of the inside cover of a newspaper, it still doesn't erase in the mind what that investigation splash across the front page does. So it's better to be cautious than not. And for the smaller companies, just to take the steps necessary to have your compliance program in place to understand what it means. I mean, there's minimal steps you should be taking if you're dipping your toe overseas.
Okay. I know we have some questions in the audience, so if you can just step to the microphone and ask your question.
Good afternoon. I'm Chris Keys. I'm president of Clinical Pharmacy Associates located here in Maryland. We have engineer, lawyering, marketing. Some of these speak to consultancy within the service industry, business model, and I don't know that I heard anything about the practice side, but the question really speaks in an international business model for service. Consultancy is pretty clear. Practice, I'm not sure that I've heard it addressed, and so an engineer from the U.S. overseas consulting, got that. If they are practicing, raises a question about barriers to entry into the international market. And I'm thinking back, I'm in the health field, and I'm thinking back to how the Philippines provided such a large number of nurses from the Philippines to the U.S. during our nursing shortage. There was changes made in our boards of nursing and to accommodate basically a business model that provided for a need here in the U.S. Do you have any experience, or can you speak to consulting versus practice and barriers to entry of the business model internationally of such? It doesn't have to be in healthcare, it can be in engineering or in law.
On the engineering side, and I'm a recovering engineer, by the way, so it's a daily struggle. But our experience particularly is to localize those resources. So we're not sending people across the border. We needed to have Chinese-speaking engineers in China that understood the regulations, that could converse not just for language and culture, but time zone issues. So to your direct question, no, I haven't encountered that. I don't know if it's an issue on the law side or the PR side.
Talking about public relations, I mean, I was very, very conscious of the fact when I opened these two offices, these two joint ventures, that I was by far and away the biggest line item cost of both of those operations. So I think if anything, in my business over the last 15, 20 years in markets in Asia and in China in particular, there's been a push to localize. Now, public relations people don't necessarily have to be licensed per se or anything like that. But I think now if you look back at the offices I started, there are probably very few people with faces that look like mine, and all the management employees down to the entry level are local Chinese. So in that particular case, it was just economics dictated that we were gonna localize and train the managers who would follow me.
You want to talk about that with Elvin? So I think one thing that we've experienced, a lot of our work is done on a consultancy basis. So a lot of our design work, our interaction with clients from the design side is consultancy, but when we deliver our management solutions, we do require people on the ground. One of the things that makes it easy for our industry, we're in a leisure or hospitality type industry, so that's not really a protected industry in most foreign governments. I think with countries that have signed onto the WTO and have different types of regulatory structure in place, you can look to see in certain industries what type of restrictions. I know China publishes, large lists of different segments and industries on the areas where, they might heavily regulate who can come into the country and provide certain services. We're very fortunate in our company that we don't get into a lot of that regulatory compliance. There's actually, even the contracts themselves and payment is less regulated because it's lower dollar threshold. It's not a protected industry. But I think the more, specifically with internet access and people publishing more type of regulatory documents, smaller businesses, without having to, I guess, initially spend tons of money on lawyer assistance or regulatory, can at least get the research started, and then you can ask more pertinent questions to people like Alex that have, so much experience and can help, guide you on the regulatory side. I think just understanding the industry you're in and whether or not it's heavily regulated or not is a good first step to then understand, okay, is it permissible to stay as a consultant and still achieve our business goals? Or do we really have to, as they were saying, get that local support, have people on the ground, and what it's going to take to actually achieve that, I think, is an important first step and helps you ask the right questions.
So at a macro level, you have the WTO's General Agreement on Trade and Services, which is the equivalent of your tariff schedule for services. It will detail country by country basis whether or not an entity is accepted in a particular line of business for commercial presence. So can you go and set up a line of business in that particular country and have that protected by the WTO rules? So the technical barriers to trade or whatever that Mike had talked about would apply. From a practical basis, though, we could talk more about it after. Do you want to be over there? Because do you want to subject yourselves to suit, to foreign taxes? Do you want to have a rep office, a branch office? Do you want to have a fully fledged operating entity? Can you do it, your particular service? This is what a lot of lawyers will do. Can you provide your service in a memo and send it abroad? Again, understanding that you cannot vouch for the particular laws of that foreign jurisdiction, as I can't vouch for the particular laws or give advice on the laws of a foreign jurisdiction. But I can certainly do that under U.S. law. Here's how it would apply. So depending on your particular factual situation, I think the analysis is going to depend on how you want to approach it.
One other important thing in that regard is visas. Our consultants travel often and go into different jurisdictions. We had a situation where somebody was on the ground for, I think, 78 days, left to come home, and then was hoping to go back to finish a project and was stopped by customs and said, you've exceeded your visa stay, and hadn't necessarily applied for the right work permits and all these other things. So part of it as well in this regulatory compliance is, well, how long can my people, if I'm merely consulting, is it a week-long project? Am I even allowed to have these people on the ground for 6-8 months at a time if it's a short-term project? Countries sometimes have these protections in place to help develop their own economies to where they want you to hire local people. When we created our Hong Kong subsidiary, it's required that at least one of our people eventually is a Hong Kong national or a local in order to grow the business there. So some countries, it's important to look at the employment side as well. They may require that a percentage of your employee workforce is a local national workforce. So it's looking at that and, okay, how do I find these people now? I'm required to do this. I need to take this next step. I don't know 20% of 150 people that can be Hong Kong nationals to fill this need, and then working with USIAC and other resources to try to find the right people for the position, I think, is a good next step.
And understand how to reduce your tax burden. So there's a foreign source income exemption in the United States, so that if you're outside the United States for over a certain period of time in a moving 365-day window, then you have a block, which is a credit towards your taxes, which is nice because you're not here. At the same time, if you overstay by a certain period in certain other jurisdictions, you have to file taxes there. So I think it's factually driven.
So it sounds like having feet on the ground is the ideal scenario, but in the event that you're unable to, what tools or do you all normally use in order to sort of communicate with those international clients as well as work with remote staff? Is it video conferencing? Like what are you using?
We use Skype the most, I think, as far as a business practice and connecting. I think the one thing, and the panel will obviously be able to speak to this, you have to be prepared for long nights. If you're in foreign jurisdictions, you're going to get the 1 or 2 a.m. calls that last an hour or 2 hours long that you have no choice but to be available in the middle of the night. And going international to do business, from what I've learned and with our company, is that it's an investment. You're investing your time, your money, your energy, and the return might not be, I think somebody else on the last panel said, a first sale in 3 months. If you're not looking at it as an investment, and you're just looking at it as doing business as normal, it's probably not a well-vetted idea at that point. So I think that's a big concern to keep in mind.
You start comparing frequent flyer plans, truly spend a lot of seat time.
And also discount what John said slightly because he has 2 kids, one kid and one on the way, so the 2 a.m. calls he's used to.
Yeah, so, bottle in one hand, my headphone in the other, that's right.
Hi, Steve. Actually, I have 2 questions. One for you, Steve, and that is, how do you begin to build a brand? And Alex, just wondering if your firm ever takes cases on a contingency.
Well, building a brand in my business is built client by client. So, you know, if and when I want to credential myself for having, you know, done work in China, you know, I usually lead with the fact that, you know, I helped the firm that I worked for and my team, and I helped open the first Walmart supercenter in China. And we introduced the cold, crisp taste of Budweiser to 1.2 billion Chinese. So, you know, our brand, if you will, that kind of goes back to the earlier question.
Ganbei.
Ganbei is right. Is not necessarily the fact that we are American experts in marketing and public relations, but that we have helped these iconic, you know, and not just American companies, but, you know, during my time in China, virtually all of our clients, this has changed now, but all of our clients were foreign to China. They were European, they were Japanese, they were American, et cetera. So that's really how we built success stories and that sort of thing, as we sort of, you know, promoted constantly once we'd done a project for a client.
And to answer your question, yeah, of course, we'll accept contingencies, but they have to be the right case based on the right facts and the potential for return. So it's obviously not necessarily a sure thing, but the amount of recovery has to justify the expenses and the anticipated effort. But you opened up a great softball question to the next, which is, unlike other law firms, we really like alternative fee arrangements. I have some great clients that I put on a fixed fee that there's one fee for the entire year, and we break it up into 12 payments at the beginning of every month. They don't have a clock that starts. They feel very happy that they can call me. And it's great for me because I get vested with the client, and they can share what they have, and I can identify other issues and help them avoid other problems. So
I can attest, for as busy as he is always available as well. It's definitely a good relationship.
And my phone is ringing. So
2 a.m. emails. And your kids are a little bit grown.
yeah, 6 and 9.
Well, this actually concludes this particular panel. This was great, discussing
Can we take
some
one
of
more,
the challenges.
or we can talk after?
Well, we're out of town, out of time for now, but certainly you can take the question after the fact. But I just wanted to thank each of you for taking time out of your afternoon and sharing your expertise with us this afternoon. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Of selling services overseas. By some estimates, service industries account for close to 80% of the gross domestic product in the United States. Exports of services totaled some $58